Okay, this week we're going to talk about plot twists. That applies to one story from last week. That's The Lottery. And then we've got two new stories this week. Young Goodman Brown, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. So let's talk about The Lottery first. We talked in a previous video last week about how we're never inside a character's head. That contrasts On the Rainy River by Tim O'Brien, where we spend the vast majority of that story sort of deliberating, should he go or should he not go inside the character's head. That was a first-person narrator. The Lottery has a third-person narrator. So that we have a different point of view, right? And so in The Lottery, the suspense is built by the narrator withholding details about the physical world, right? It would be very easy at the beginning of the story to say, whoa, this is the lottery. You might think it's this great thing where you win millions of dollars, but it's actually this really creepy thing where the village gets together and stones one of its citizens. So it's a withholdal, is that a word? It's the author withholding information from the narrator, and that builds suspense, okay? But these are details of the physical world, and we never get inside the head. The suspense or the twists that happen in this week's stories, I think, happen in a different kind of way. In both of these stories, we're inside the heads of these characters. Now I want to point out that we technically have third-person narrators in these stories. They're not told from the first-person point of view. There are no eyes, right? But we have what we would call a third-person kind of omniscient narrator. Let's contrast that to the narrator that we have in The Lottery. The Lottery is a third-person, what we would call limited, because that narrator does not have the option of sort of passing between walls and getting inside of characters' heads, right? In some narrators, you'll be able to get inside one character's head, but you're just sort of sitting over the shoulder of that character throughout the entire story or novel. And if it's a husband, you might have the husband's point of view, but you never get to pass into the wife's point of view. So that's what we call a third-person limited point of view. In these stories, in The Lottery, we're never even inside of one character's head. So it's a third-person, extremely limited point of view. In these stories, we have a third-person, slightly more omniscient, right? So in addition to the details of the physical world that we get, we're also privy to the happenings of the mind, right? And the plot twists in both of these stories come from altered mental states, right? In Young Goodman Brown, he has this hallucination. Actually, he doesn't know if it's a hallucination. I think he's hoping that it is, but he's not really sure. So there's this incident in the forest. It sort of trips him out, and he's trying to figure out at the end of the story whether or not it's real. At the end of the story, he doesn't know, the readers don't know. And that suspense, that tension there is built because we've been dwelling inside the mind of that character. And that works sort of mechanically in a very different way than it does in The Lottery. A very similar sort of thing happens in An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, right? Again, technically it's a third-person narrator, but really, the lines between the third person and the first person get blurred, right? Because if it was strictly a third-person limited narrator, we would never be able to know what's happening inside that character's head. So we get much more than just the physical details of the world in that story. We get what's happening inside the character's head. So I would say it's a third-person, slightly omniscient. It's kind of tough to characterize these things. It's not purely omniscient because we don't know every single character's head. We don't know what the sergeant is thinking at the top of the bridge who's shooting down at him. But it's not strictly the physical details of that world, right? So the lines are kind of blurred. And so the suspense that's being built in these stories functions in a different way than it does in The Lottery. And, The Lottery it's just withholding information. And here we're relying on something, I don't know if I would call it supernatural. Maybe it is in Young Goodman Brown, depending on how you want to read that story. But it has to do with the crazy things that can happen in the mind. I definitely understand what's happening in An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge because the guy's about to die, right? He doesn't want that to happen, so he's creating this elaborate fantasy where he escapes, and it's only, at the end of the fantasy that we realize, and he realizes that he's dead, right? Although, maybe he doesn't even realize that he's dead. Maybe only the reader realizes it. I don't know if, as you're dying, you have that sort of epiphany. I don't know. But I just want to point out that we have different kinds of narrators in these stories, and because of the different types of narrators and their point of view, the information that they are privy to and the information that we are privy to, suspense works in a slightly different way. And so if we were going to characterize the suspense used in these stories versus the suspense built in The Lottery, they're taking two different tracks, right? So it's just the author withholding information of the physical world in The Lottery, and then in the two stories this week, the narrators are really playing with the emotions of the mind and what's happening up here, right? And a lot of crazy things can happen up here, so it's a really great way, it's a great place to dwell if you're a narrator, because anything can really happen, as you can see this in these stories. Especially the young Goodman Brown is really kind of trippy. So I just want you to keep these things in mind, because the sort of position of a narrator in a story can sometimes affect how the story is told and what's going to happen in that story.